that exist for issuing this product in sub-Saharan Africa. The report is actually available on our website. If you have not had a chance to look at it, I invite you to do so when you have an opportunity. And just following on from that work, what we did again together with UN Women is to host a dissemination webinar in September of last year, where we had a really thought-provoking discussion on of the report and welcoming your views and comments on the work that was undertaken. Again, if you missed this, welcome to have a look at that on our website and on our YouTube channel. So one of the questions that we put to you participants, if you were able to join us then, is whether you would be interested in participating in a more technical workshop. And the purpose of this would be to explore the technicalities of issuing a gender bond. And we did get a resounding yes, and that is why we are here today. So this gives us indeed another opportunity to remind ourselves what are gender bonds, and to give us an opportunity also to dive in deeper to understand what are some of the key considerations that need to be borne in mind when issuing gender bonds, and indeed how to grow this market, which is quite nascent. So if you have any lingering thoughts from those discussions, any ideas or questions that were left, pending or unanswered, and you've been thinking about it since that time, this is the opportunity that we have to really delve in deeper. And if you're new to this discussion, please just join in. We are really delighted to hear from you, and we are happy to hear and to learn from each other's experiences in this session. So welcome. So today we're joined by a very eminent panel of speakers, and even before I introduce them, we are really keen to know which part of the ecosystem you represent. And so I'll request my colleague Angela to kindly put up the first poll, and we'll just take 1 or 2 minutes to get your quick answers. So, and yeah, so we've got quite a number of answers coming in. Development finance institutions, 30%. And if the part of the ecosystem that you represent is not indicated here, please feel free to indicate in the chat box. Great, so just a few more seconds before we close this. It seems most of us are coming in from the good number from who are gender experts, regulators, and of course a number of investors. So welcome, really good to see this. So thank you for this. And I'll request if we could see the results. I hope you can see the results. Great. So thanks for participating in that. Good to know who's in the room with us today. So without much ado, I'd really like to now introduce the speakers that we have with us today. And even as they begin their session, please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. Please put in any comments that you may have in the the chat box. And if you have any specific questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll be happy to sweep that up as we move along. So to just start off in terms of introducing the speakers, today we are joined by Gaia Di Battista. She's the Executive Director at Lion's Head Global Partners, and they undertook the initial that we did on viability of issuing gender bonds in sub-Saharan Africa. She leads the sustainable finance advisory practice at Lion's Head. We're also joined by Robin Oates, who is a finance specialist at UN Women and supports UN's innovative finance strategy and the development of sovereign gender bonds and relevant gender lens standards. We're also happy to have with us Evan Brunner, who is the regional manager for the Sustainable Finance Solutions team at Sustainalytics and has contributed to the execution of over 100 second-party opinion products. We are also privileged to have with us Suzanne Beagle, founder of Catalyst at Large and co-producer of the just concluded Global Gender Smart Summit. Last but not least, we also have with us Lisbeth Bronda from UN Women, Senior Advisor, Innovative Finance at UN Women. and she is a senior contributor to the UN policy recommendations and process around financing for development at UNGA 2020. So with that, I will just quickly hand it over to you, Gaia, to take us through the next part of this session. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you for hosting this second webinar. So as Mary said, we had a previous webinar which provided an overview of the gender bond landscape. And in this webinar, we're going to be a little bit more focused on the technical aspects of gender bonds, so trying to get into the practical side of things. So our agenda for today is as follows: a quick recap on what gender bonds are, just a reminder if anybody wasn't able to attend the previous installment. Then we will look quickly at different bond structures. So what form can gender bonds take? Then my colleague Robin from UN Women will provide a sidebar on sovereign bonds and the potential there. Then we'll quickly look at uses of proceeds and standards, so current and future. And then we'll go through the issuance process, so the practical issuance process for a gender bond. And then Evan from Sustainalytics will give us some insights and experience from the field of providing second-party opinions for gender bonds. And then Mary will close out with Nexus and the future of gender bonds. So off we go. So a quick recap, what is a gender bond? A gender bond is a debt instrument which is issued to support or otherwise align broadly with gender equality and women's empowerment goals. So the idea is that a gender bond should result in some benefit to a group of women in one way or another, directly or indirectly. However, unlike green and social bonds, there is no universally accepted definition of what a gender bond is. Most gender bonds issued to date have been of the use of proceeds kind, which we will talk about in a second, and have been aligned with the social bond principles. So under the social bond principles, women is one of the target populations which you can target through your social bond. So gender bonds, much like other labeled debt, can take any form. These can be senior unsecured instruments, securitizations, covered bonds. These are all possible. There have been a number of issuances to date. The market's still very much nascent, with strong representation from the financial institutions as issuers. So what are the different bond types that gender bonds can take? So the first and most familiar labeled debt instrument are use of proceeds bonds. So these are bonds whereby you must identify upfront how you're going to use the proceeds of the bond, and then earmark those proceeds and only allocate them to those pre-identified uses. This is the sort of bond that green bonds and traditional social bonds take. So when would it be helpful for an issuer to use this kind of bond? If you have specific projects or activities that are gender equality aligned or particularly focused on benefits for women, and you're able to sort of clearly define these and allocate capital to them within your business, then this could be a good bond structure for you to look at. When do we expect investors to be interested in these kinds of bonds? If you want to support specific gender-related activities, so if you want clarity on my dollars are going to go towards this particular use, which I've been told about, and I will be updated from the issuer on with regards to this to progress, then this is the right structure for you. The second structure that we want to talk about is Kpi Linked Bonds, and these are a newer form of labeled debt, certainly in the sort of environmental space and sustainability space. These are more recent. We've seen a few of these called Sustainability Linked Bond or SDG Linked Bonds. And the main difference with use of proceeds bonds is that these bonds don't require you to ring-fence proceeds for its specific use. Rather, the way these work and the way you include gender or other thematics into these bonds is by saying, I, as an issuer, have a broader strategy in place around gender, whereby I am targeting to achieve targets X, Y, and Z by a certain date. And so I would like to raise some capital to support my efforts in that endeavor. And so you can actually use the proceeds for general corporate expenditure or general budget without needing to ring-fence them. So there is a little bit of a catch here, which is that to date, in order to make sure that these bonds are, the issuers are aligned with what they're saying that they're going to be doing, there have been sticks included in the structure. What does that mean? Typically, there is a coupon step up in the bond, or this has happened, where the issuer doesn't meet the targets that they've set for themselves. There's a strong emphasis on these targets being ambitious, but also it is obviously important that they are realizable with the appropriate amount of effort. So this is a slightly different approach. When could this be useful? When could an issuer want to issue something like this? If you're implementing, for example, a business strategy or policy change, if you're realigning the way that you're doing things internally, then this could be a really good instrument for you. When do we think investors might be interested in something like this? When they want to support a change in behavior or strategy within the issuer. This is an appropriate instrument. So before I go on to number 3, I actually quickly wanted to touch on this box we have on the right. There was a recent issuance by IDB Invest and Davivienda, a Colombian financial institution, which was a hybrid of use of proceeds and Kpi Linked. So they, Davivienda, with IDB's help, structured a use of proceeds bond whereby the proceeds would be used to grow their lending to women-owned SMEs and for social mortgages for women. But at the same time, there's a KPI target in there, whereby there is a bonus, so the opposite of a coupon step up. If Davivienda manages to grow their women-owned SME lending portfolio from 20% to 27% of the business. So this is very interesting as it encapsulates both types of structures. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about corporate behavior bonds. These are a structure that we introduced in our last webinar. I want to say these are very specific to gender. We haven't seen a lot of these in other thematic areas. Here, the proceeds are used to lend to companies. So the proceeds of the bond are used to on-lend to companies that are doing well, have in the gender space. So they have good policies in place around gender equality, either within their operations, within their senior management. And so you can think of these a little bit as rewarding good internal action. But the ultimate borrowers, these companies being lent to because they're doing very well on a gender scale, are not restricted in the way that they use the proceeds. So it's not strictly, ultimately, a use of proceeds bond. It's a little bit of a different structure. And the way to think about these is a little bit similar to ESG, where you are sort of screening for good companies and saying, we will reward you with this loan because you're doing really well on a gender policy perspective. A couple of the bonds that have been issued in this space have included sort of growth and stretch targets, but not all of them, and it's not necessary. So when would somebody want to issue a bond like this, these corporate behavior bonds? If you have, for example, a large corporate loan portfolio and you want to engender good gender behavior in that portfolio, you could look at something like this. And as an investor, when might you consider a product like this? If you're looking to reward good gender practices, so good behavior within a sector. So these are the different types. Now we will hear a little bit from my colleague Robin at UN Women on the potential for sovereign gender bonds.
Thank you, Gaia. So the issuance of a sovereign gender bond can provide a strong signal of a country's commitment to an equal and inclusive society, attract new investors, and mobilize private capital towards the sustainable development goals. We know that narrowing the global gender gap in all areas of economic, social, and political life is not only equitable in the broader sense, but is shown to be one of the largest boosters of GDP. A recent McKinsey study on COVID and gender parity predicts that investing now to advance gender equality can increase the global GDP by 13 trillion in 2030. Conversely, doing nothing to address these inequalities will reduce global GDP by up to 1 trillion. So when we look and consider the role of governments and review government spending on gender, we see that spending on gender priorities is highly variable, depending on institutional priorities, capacity, and political will. A recent study also collected on over 2,000 post-COVID government response measures show that only 39% of these measures have been formulated with a gender perspective. So in the case of a sovereign gender bond issuance, governments would have the opportunity to clearly identify programs, budgets, and expenditure, as well as key objectives that are underpinned by their gender national action plans. A successful issuance in this case is very much dependent on the tracking mechanisms that are in place to allocate, monitor, and disclose the use of proceeds, or the progress towards achieving key outcomes. And therefore, the linkage between financing and approved gender outcomes creates additional transformative mechanisms within government institutions for transparency and accountability. So the question is, why now? Well, following the severe economic effects of COVID and with global public debt expected to reach over 101% of global GDP this year, investors are looking for greater transparency over sovereign debt accumulation and sustainability. This has accelerated the idea that sovereign bond issuances should be tied to the Sustainable Development Goals. So with the demand for robust and verifiable thematic bonds increasing rapidly, the issuance of a sovereign gender bond provides an opportunity to positively distinguish itself as a market leader in proactively addressing inequality. It also provides potential to access a more diverse pool of investors. So if we look at now how this could potentially be structured, the gender element must of course be built into the bond framework in a concrete manner, either through direct budget and expenditure, referred to, as Guy's already mentioned, the use of proceeds, or through commitments to achieve a specific target, also known as an outcomes-based bond. So in the case of the use of proceeds, the proceeds of the bond is directly allocated to eligible expenditure. We provided a few examples below, and these are very much linked to the Gender National Action Plan of the government. So it could be financing the purchase of land, where land will be reallocated to women farmers. It could be financing the construction of relevant healthcare facilities or services, or underwriting the loans for women entrepreneurs. So the bond proceeds are exclusively used to finance these identified budget activities. The other benefit of this type of structure is that it does contribute to providing greater budgetary security and predictability for the relevant ministry, as the budget allocations would be agreed at the beginning of the loan term. This is, as we've heard already, the most popular type of thematic bond, and with verification provides investors with the confidence that the capital invested is being used in line with the stated activities. The second type of bond is the gender-linked or outcomes-based bond, where commitments are made to reach specific targets by a specific date, by specific policies and initiatives. So baselines and key performance indicators are established. So for example, a commitment to achieve a predetermined percentage increase in the value of public procurement contracts held by women-owned businesses, or a percentage reduction in the prevalence of violence against women. As this structure is aligned with policy actions and provides government greater flexibility in how to allocate the capital raised, it does necessitate obviously adequate transparency around relevant baselines and targets, And has already been mentioned by Gaia, generally the cost of capital will increase or decrease based on whether the agreed outcomes are achieved. This is a less common type of structure, but as Gaia has already noted, the Colombian bank Da Vivienda has recently issued an outcomes and use of proceeds based bond with the hope and the intention that this landmark issuance will catalyze the wider gender lens investing market. So with that overview of gender bonds, I'll hand back to Gaia for a review of the existing guidance available.
Thank you, Robin. That's great. If you're thinking about issuing a gender bond today, I think one of the key things to think about is what guidance and standards are available in the market for you to reference. As we said, there is no universal definition of a gender bond, but there is guidance out there to be used as standards, and there are different types. So the one that's been most frequently used are the social bond principles. So within the social bond principles, there are two sections that if you want to issue a social bond, you sort of have to align with. The first is eligible activities. So is what you're funding, the fundamental activity you're financing, is that eligible as a social activity with a social benefit coming out of it? And the second is a target population. So that activity needs to go and benefit a specific population, which you've identified and you believe to have been previously either underserved or disadvantaged in some way. And lucky for us, women fit in that category. But one thing that's really important to point out here is that there needs to be an existing social issue or disadvantage or lack of service that you're trying to improve through your there are other standards and reference guidance that you can use as well. So obviously there's SDG 5, which is sort of gives you a broad thematic to work to, or the 2X challenge criteria. The 2X challenge criteria was actually designed for gender lens investing, which is broader than just bonds, but is very useful in that it gives you a set of guidance, quite concrete guidance on what qualifies as being gender inclusive or gender supportive. So for example, if you're thinking about sort of a gender bond looking at women in the corporate workspace, and you're looking to reward companies that have women in senior management, what's the cutoff for what qualifies as being able to be labeled gender? And so the 2X criteria is very useful for that. It also touches on things like consumption, which is very important.
What's that? Yeah, I'm up to speaking in a minute.
Sorry, whoever is not on mute, could you please go on mute? Thank you. Consumption, which we'll talk about in a second, but essentially guidance with regards to products and services which disproportionately benefit women or girls. So that's something else that's very useful. So these are the kinds of reference standards you might look at if you were wanting to issue a gender bond today. So what have people issued gender bonds for up until now? We talked about this in the first webinar, but here is a recap. So the vast majority of bonds issued to date fall into two buckets. The first is corporate behavior bonds. We talked about these. These are bonds where the proceeds are used on lend to companies sort of behaving well from a gender perspective. These have been issued primarily by banks and insurance companies, and in Canada and Australia today. And they make up a very large amount of the market by dollar equivalent. The other end of the spectrum, we have financial inclusion. This has been the second leading theme of gender bonds. And really this is about lending or increasing lending or enabling lending to women and women-owned businesses. The driving force here has been primarily financial institutions, again, often with support from the broader development finance community, so DFIs and MDBs helping to structure and then at times also purchase the bonds. And these have been primarily issued in emerging economies. And the use of proceeds, as I said here, has been financing or refinancing lending. What's really important to note is that these two types of bonds impact very different sets of women in very different sets of ways. But there is a thread running through both of these, which is there is a previous issue or disadvantage being experienced by these groups, which the bonds are trying to address, whether it's lack of access to capital or a gender pay gap, lack of representation in senior positions within a firm. So very different, but both very, very relevant. So what could use of proceeds look like in the future? And really here, the sky's the limit. And one thing that we would love to hear from actually the audience here is, if you're thinking about a gender bond, or if your client is thinking about a gender bond, sort of what business activities or what activities are they thinking about including? Because I think there's room for breadth here. So we've presented a few potential other uses of proceeds which haven't been used as much to date. And these include things like women in the supply chain. So if you are an industrial a corporate and you're looking to improve the conditions or the participation of women-owned businesses in your supply chain, a gender bond could be a good instrument to help you on that path. Equally, women-focused services, so focusing on services that really provide a disproportionate benefit specifically to women and girls is another one. And equally, and we touched on this just above, women-focused products. So products that provide a benefit particularly to women. And in this, we can think about things like affordable menstrual health, but also, depending on the setting that you're in, access to water and sanitation in low-income settings. This is a reality in many settings where there is no access to water, for example, piped water. It is the job of women and girls to go and fetch that, which takes time away from their ability to obtain an education or to be included in the labor force. So these are all things that could go into a gender bond, either as use of proceeds or as an SDG linked bond. So this sort of stretch target that we talked about earlier. One thing that we wanted to highlight here is always keeping in mind this concept of underserved and disadvantaged beneficiaries from the bond. So who are you providing a service for that was not previously receiving that service or that good? And so, for example, if you're setting up sort of luxury high-end clinics, maternal health clinics, that doesn't really match the spirit of what one of these bonds should do. So hopefully that's food for thought for people to also sort of come back to us with thoughts and comments on other uses of proceeds, and questions, by the way, always welcome. So next I wanted to quickly talk about the gender climate nexus, because this sort of ties in with use of proceeds. There is an increasing amount of literature and evidence around how gender and climate issues are linked. And really addressing them together is a real opportunity and can multiply impact, and that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, in a sense. So some of the issues that we're aware of linking climate and gender some are very specific and direct. And for example, in a lot of developing countries, for example, where women are the majority of subsistence farmers, they are immediately some of the people who are most affected by climate change impact. So whether through drought, floods, and so on, but they're also the least able to address it. Subsistence farmers don't have a lot of extra cash on the side to spend on fancy seeds, varietals, and access to insurance, access to smart irrigation, things like this. So women can be disproportionately affected by some of these things. On the other side, women are also mathematically less represented in some of the solutions designed to some of these things. Fewer women in the workforce, fewer girls getting an education results in fewer female brains, essentially, working on any given issue. So These are some of the ways in which there's nexus. And then this gives us an opportunity, though, as sustainable finance as a sector, as a set of instruments grows, we have the opportunity to include gender considerations in these instruments, and in that way make sure that adaptation and mitigation mechanisms are gender inclusive, ensure that women share in the benefit of a transition to a sustainable economy through having access to education, employment, fair wages, working conditions, and ultimately more female participation across the economy, and sort of greater opportunity for women and girls to come up with new ways of addressing climate change as well. So this is something that there's a lot of work being done on. I know Suzanne has recently been working on research in this space. So something definitely worth thinking about for everybody. And now on to a slightly more practical slide. Issuing a gender bond today, what are the steps? What is the process? So we talked about the guidance available, but what do you need to do if you want to issue a gender bond? So the very first step is, as an issuer, to either yourself or with the help of an advisor, so that's what I spend a lot of my time on at Lion's Head, working to understand what in your business, or if you're a sovereign, what in your policies and budget is gender aligned, or how could you improve the gender inclusivity of what you're doing, and in that way determine the type of bond that is appropriate for you. So should you be looking at use of proceeds, should you be looking at a SDG 5 linked bond, and ensure that sort of your treasury team is on board with all of this. And then the second step is drafting a framework, so explaining how you are using the gender label here. So whether it's, if you're doing a use of proceeds bond, you need to explain your eligibility criteria for the activities you're looking to allocate capital to. If you're doing an SDG linked bond, sort of what are your targets and how are these ambitious? How are you going to reach these targets? And then also explain to your investors how you're going to report to them on your progress and your impact. Then second party opinion, this is very important, having an independent entity come in and look through your framework, look through what you're doing and say, like, yes, we agree, this is in the spirit and in alignment with the guidance available. We think this is a great bond. I should say one thing here, which is increasingly investors are broadly very much interested in understanding how a specific labeled debt instrument fits with your broader company policies and strategies. So it's always good to keep that in mind. If you're doing a use of proceeds bond, great, you're financing this thing here, but how are you also thinking about gender more broadly within your activities? And then finally, but absolutely not last, investor engagement. This is actually something that you would start doing fairly early on, engaging with your current investors, but also potentially new investors who are interested in this theme of gender, and making sure that they are brought along on the journey and they are interested in what you're thinking about. And you would do that through your bond managers and your underwriters and your advisors. So down here, we've included a little ecosystem of who's who in this space. So obviously you have your issuers. We talked about the reference bodies and standards, Challenge, ICMA, the UN and UN Women doing a lot of work on this. Data and insight providers, for example, here, Equileap is an entity that assesses gender alignment within corporates. Their assessments have been used in the corporate behavior bonds, for example, and then independent opinions for the likes of Sustainalytics, KPMG, Vijay, and we will hear from Sustainalytics shortly. And then your bond managers, underwriters, and banks. These guys need to help you structure these things and get you to market. And then ultimately the investors. So this is sort of the high level. How do you do this? And now we will actually hear from Evan at Sustainalytics, who have worked on gender bonds, about his experiences and their experiences from the field. Then I believe Mary, our gracious host, is going to provide some closing thoughts and remarks on next steps for gender bonds. So thank you very much. Over to you, Evan.
Great. Thanks so much, Gaia, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody around the globe. Pleasure to be a part of this webinar today. And unfortunately, we're not meeting in person, but more than happy to contribute to this exciting discussion around gender bonds and provide a little bit of insight from Sustainalytics experience in the field. I can say that to date we've really only worked on one published gender bond that has hit the market. I'm sure some folks on this call have seen this gender bond, which was from Kpi Insurance Group. This was a particularly unique structure in terms of it was not a traditional use of proceeds, as Gaia has been mentioning, where the allocation is being made from a specific bond issuance to specific projects or activities. This was more of a structure where funds were being raised and then invested into groups, and then their metrics and KPIs would be determined by women leadership and women participation in these businesses. So it was kind of a hybrid use of proceeds, KPI / an investment into a fund approach, which is not typically what we see in the other types of formats where we, as Guy already outlined quite clearly, use of proceeds is going towards specific projects or activities. We also can see SME financing within that, within the usual social bond or gender bond framework type of structure. And then there's obviously the newer sustainability linked bond, or we could say a gender linked bond type of instrument, and has already been highlighted as related to KPIs, which are more operational level. Speaking specifically to the experience that we had from the QBE Insurance Group experience, it was a difficult opinion for us to opine extremely positively on, because when we are looking at a traditional framework where we're looking at the allocation of proceeds to specific projects or activities, the idea is really that we want to be able to ensure traceability so that impact can be identified. So going back to some of the comments that were made earlier about identifying a specific target population, and then within the context of overall social categories, particularly gender categories, reporting on the impacts within these types of areas has been it's been a challenge for the industry overall. So I think that there's improvement that needs to be seen along the impact reporting side, and ensuring and providing investors with an adequate level of assurance that yes, if they do want to invest into a specific gender bond type of format, that is going to deliver impact in terms of social equality, women empowerment, or other types of issues that might be addressed. So that kind of feeds into some of the challenges that we see when we're thinking about gender bond principles. And it's always great to be a part of these kinds of conversations, because as I highlighted in one of my bullet points here, this is somewhat similar to what we're seeing within the world of blue bonds. So we have gender bonds and we have blue bonds. Gender bonds currently are sitting under the overall framework of social bonds, whereas blue bonds are sitting under the broader framework of green bonds. So how do we expand the interest from the investor market into these separate areas in an adequate way, so that there's not too much confusion between the two? Meaning, if I'm an investor and I'm looking at a gender bond, why is this not just a regular social bond? So being able to delineate and identify what the concrete difference is, so that can really set aside and demonstrate the value of these particular types of bonds over the more traditional ICMA principles that we see out there. And then already, as mentioned, the difficulty of being able to substantiate impact. I think that this, to be honest, is something that could speak to a broader challenge within the traditional bond market, sustainability bond market, which is that there needs to be just a more robust and a stronger commitment to high-level reporting. And when we're talking about qualitative reporting, this is always inherently more of a challenge. So it's not a surprise that we see this challenge in this area. But the more that so the impact can be substantiated, then from a social impact perspective, it becomes easier to build that narrative. And so this will help dispel some of the general ambiguity around the concept of what is a gender bond, and making sure that people are very familiar that gender bond of course, it's associated with the empowerment of women, with gender equality, but within the context of Sustainalytics working with social bonds and the one limited gender bond that we have seen, gender issues most often tend to be those that are related to the financing of socioeconomic empowerment and advancement through SME financing, financing of women-owned enterprises and businesses. But there are a lot more that can be done there. There's a lot of opportunities, which brings us to the last section that I have highlighted here. And it's already been touched on a bit. There's an immense amount of human resource capacity that can be what's the word that I'm looking for, that can be basically coalesced in order to deliver a greater impact by bringing gender equality to the forefront when it comes to climate issues, because by having women who are in leadership positions and who are able to contribute more, that benefits society as a whole. It can help us tackle climate change issues from multiple fronts that we don't traditionally see with regular use of proceeds when it comes to renewable energy or focusing on access to education and access to healthcare. There's this unmet opportunity that we can achieve if we identify some of these issues more concretely and where we can really deliver impact within that context. And within the sustainable finance community, we're continuing to see interest in these areas, specifically within the gender bond and the blue bond areas, where we're coming across issuers and investors who want to know more about these. And it's really an excellent opportunity for those of us in the sustainable finance community to participate and communicate in conversations and conferences and webinars like this, where we can really start to highlight the potential impact of being able to issue more gender bonds or gender linked instruments. And from that perspective, again, there are far more opportunities to finance gender equality outside of just SME and microfinancing. Women are a part of the economy in all regards, and so we should be looking at it in a much broader aspect than simply the traditional SME microfinancing or healthcare. I would think is one that we typically see women being slightly more included in, but really the opportunities are boundless. We see a lot of growth within the area in terms of interest, plenty of potential, and I would certainly be curious to know what others think on the call in terms of questions within this area, and then whether it's related to traditional financing of use of proceeds or sustainability linked instruments. I think that there are also separate conversations that can be had in the role that those instruments can play when it comes to further developing the gender bond or gender finance instrument market and bringing more impact into the sector.
Great, thank you, Evan.
Of course.
And now over to Mary for some thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Gaia. It's a really interesting discussion, and I think the big question is, so where do we go from here? What we are saying is basically that the gender bond market is a very nascent market. I think the total funds raised to date is around a little over maybe $2 billion USD, which is really little compared to other thematic bonds. And so I think that really points to the fact that there is an opportunity for growth. But when you think about the practicalities of actually issuing a gender bond, I think in this presentation, a lot has been shared about, some of the questions that really need to be answered, and just a lot of clarity around what exactly is a gender bond in terms of what are the eligible activities to which the proceeds of a gender bond can be applied. Also, what are the gender bond issuance requirements? What is required? So I think clarity around these kind of things is very important. Even as Evan has talked about, it makes it a bit more clearer and clear to be able to measure impact, and that of course catalyzes more capital. So as we've had, there are several standards out there, social bond principles, the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, SDG 5, and the 2X challenge criteria, and which are all great and all take a different approach. For instance, the social bond principles, they provide issuance guidance and encourage the issuance of a second party opinion for a gender bond to qualify under the social bond principles. The others provide some specificity on the gender aspects in terms of, from a outcome perspective or even eligibility perspective, what may qualify for purposes of, channeling funds, use of proceeds from a gender bond to those eligible projects. So what are those eligible projects? I think those principles or standards are a bit more, clear on that. So it may be useful to have a holistic standard that kind of speaks to both, both ends of the spectrum, one on the issuance requirements, and then secondly also on the, eligibility criteria for gender bonds, just to provide more clarity. And we believe that when that clarity is out there, then there may be indeed, greater participation both by issuers and investors. Of course, the investors are keen to get that kind of clarity and transparency, just to build confidence in this market. And so we also think, as has been mentioned previously, that of course gender bonds would also, growth of the gender bond market would also lend itself to growth of, other, sustainable finance products being issued with a more deliberate gender focus and approach in terms of, the issuance requirements and even criteria. So basically, I think as I conclude this part of this, really the last comment I would want to say in this presentation is just to say that together with UN Women, FSD Africa is looking forward to working with other partners to explore the opportunities to develop gender bond standards, because we believe that may trigger the market, to even greater heights. So we look forward to that. So I think I'll stop here. This really marks the end of this presentation, and thank you everyone for your great insights. Mine now is to hand over to Suzanne to share her thoughts and reflections on what it would take to issue gender bonds. Happy to hear your thoughts and what it may be required to really grow this market beyond where it is today. So over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Gaia and Robin and Evan, for your thoughts. I am excited just to share a minute or two of reflections, but then really want to open it up to the Q&A and to hear from other people that are on the call as well. So my name is Suzanne Beagle. As I mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Gender Smart Investing Summit. We just brought together over 500 people from around the world, from 53 countries, to talk about how we unlock gender smart capital at scale. And it was my pleasure also to get to feed into the original report. Clearly, the things that we've just talked about are that one of the things in the way is around the standards. And that we've got a number of emerging standards that are out there. And I'm working really closely with the 2X collaborative. So 2X criteria is something which just since 2018 has really been coming to the fore. And I know we have a number of 2X collaborative people on the call. But we've got as we said, social bond principles, the principles that are really coming from the UN WEPs and others, and can we really get to the point of having a good set of standards that would fit for gender bonds is one of the questions on our minds. Obviously, use of proceeds, that there's so many things we've spoken about, and I'm also reflecting back from the summit we just had, a lot of conversations around how do we increase women in the supply chain, both the number of SMEs, how do we increase financing for women SMEs, but also companies that are good for women that are in the supply chain. as we mentioned, but also things like care economy, things that are coming more to the fore now. And as we mentioned, health and education, and we had Marco Serena from PIDGE shared about at one of our climate sessions around doing an affordable housing bond that's called ACORN in Kenya, where it is student accommodation housing built green and with particular attention paid to where the needs are of women students versus male students, and really taking that into account in the design of the project. So I think our goal with this seminar was really to open people's minds and expand the thought about where could these all fit. Climate and gender, I know if you think about 185 billion in climate bonds versus 2 billion in gender bonds, can we get gender into these climate bonds, and what would that look like? And would love to hear what people are working on the continent around this. I know that there's a group from FCDO working on this in ASEAN region, but what will it take for us to be able to get the first ones of any of these different kinds that we spoke about on the continent? That's what we really want to spend the rest of our time talking about. What's in the way for you? What do you think you've got going that would give us a lift here? And so I want to just open it up now to the questions. And we've already got a number of questions coming into the Q&A. What we'll do is if we can put all of the speakers on video, I think it would be great, and just switch gears. And we'll just start right in. And if you've got more, please just keep popping them into the Q&A. We'll try and get to each of them. So a couple of questions around how gender bonds are related to climate. I know we also have with us Matteo Bigoni from FSD Africa. He's a senior climate finance specialist, and it would be great to see Matteo if you want to kick us off with some reflections about that, and then we'll move around.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my camera is not working at the moment, but basically I think that climate and gender has a massive potential in Africa, because I think it spans lots of different sectors. And I think it's very easy to potentially put a climate bond that combines. Hello?
Matteo, we've still got you.
Hi, sorry, I thought I'd been kicked out. And basically, I think one of the things that it would be very helpful from an investor perspective is to see how you can actually link groups, women's cooperatives, to capital markets. To me, that is a bit of a holy grail of investors, because essentially, if you look at the use of proceeds of climate bonds, most of them are for engineered infrastructure. Say, for instance, having renewable energy, having forest projects, etc., which is great. From a climate finance perspective, it's absolutely amazing. However, if you can link groups of women to the use of proceeds and have a structure whereby the proceeds are actually funneled to develop activities implemented by women, I think that would be a very innovative structure for capital markets. And we haven't seen many bonds like that. There have been a couple in Latin America, for instance, but nothing in Africa specifically. And I think it would be very much an attractive structure for investors, because you can basically link directly the use of proceeds to gender and social impacts. And I think I'd be very interested in exploring how this could be conducted. I have a couple of ideas, for instance, just a very simple structure that's been used in other parts of the world, for instance, using women's cooperatives or women's groups, grassroots. There are grouped in local financial institutions, so cooperatives, so agricultural banks, for instance, and linked through an intermediary, for instance, a development organization or development financial institution or government agency that would potentially provide a guarantee to those proceeds and tap, consequently, capital markets, reaching, for instance, either local or international investors. I think that would be very innovative. I think investors would love it. And I think there's really lots of potential for different activities at the grassroots level, saying, for instance, either agriculture or renewable energy or cooking fuel, for instance.
Thank you, Matteo. Gaia, did you want to comment on this at all? I have some thoughts I'd love to share, but also would love to hear from others.
Sure. I think there's, in my mind, it's also sort of let's change the conversation for good a little bit and sort of make gender inclusion sort of the standard, right? So apart from specific projects, which is wonderful, and you need everything, and I don't think the perfect should ever be the enemy of the good in general, but I think if we can just make gender inclusion just the standard for everything going forward, then I think we're just getting on top of the issue. And I think one thing that is really important is sort of giving regard to how women are impacted or could be included in the design of solutions. So given the growth of the sustainable finance space, it's a good opportunity to tag on to that in a sense, right? And get this as much limelight as climate is getting. So that's sort of my very high level view on the matter.
Yeah, I want to point out that in the report, we're really highlighting things, the climate and gender report that we issued from GenderSmart, things like, if you're doing an infrastructure project, where can you be looking for, and it's a climate related infrastructure project, where can you be looking for where the opportunities are for women employment? And that means recruitment, training, sometimes employment, really working at in the TORs and saying, we're gonna have a target around employment, or we're gonna have a target around supply chains, who is in that supply chain for that infrastructure project, and how are we really going to ensure that capital is available to male-led and female-led businesses and co-led businesses in that supply chain. So expanding people's view about what's possible across anything, whether it's energy or infrastructure or agriculture or thinking about plastics reduction, really thinking about where that full picture is. And I'm coming back to the 2X criteria, which is thinking about ownership, thinking about leadership, where are women in leadership, where do you have employment, and where do you have products and services that disproportionately benefit women and girls. So I know Evans is on the call who's the Director of Capital Markets at FSD Africa. Evans, did you want to add anything, or should we move on to another question?
No, sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. And I'm very happy and join the conversation. But I want us to move this to the next stage. And I noticed that from the people who are participating, there are a number of potential issues from Nigeria, potential issues in South Africa, in Morocco, in Kenya, and elsewhere. So I think as FSD Africa, we are very keen to see how we partner with these institutions to basically break new ground and introduce this new asset class. It is a small asset class, as Mary mentioned, but there is no reason why it cannot become as big as the as the green bonds, provided we do the right kind of things in terms of the standards, and also encourage sovereigns and as well as corporates to get into this market.
So it would be great to hear from some of those issuers and those regulators and others who are on the call about what you think is in the way for you to be able to do this. I know a couple of the questions really are about the standards, but maybe we should move on to one of the other questions. Someone asked, coming back to the issue of sub-Saharan Africa, what actions and change need to begin to happen to support a gender bond issue in the future? And so what are the tangible activities that you think need to happen next? And Mary, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a good question. One of the things that is really the starting point is, even before we talk about gender bonds in sub-Saharan Africa, I think one of the things that we always need to consider, and I think this came up in the report, is the level of development of bond markets in the region. So I think there are markets that are ahead of others in terms of having deeper bond markets compared to others, relatively compared to others within the region. And I think it's also just working to see how we can strengthen the bond market, to encourage greater transparency, even just whatever hindrances exist that prevent issuers to come to market, even dealing with those at an elementary level to start with. But going beyond that, we know that banks are already lending, for example, to women. So they may already have a portfolio of assets, just like we talk about green assets. I'm sure there are gender assets that would qualify, for purposes of, pulling those assets together and being able to issue bonds on the back of that. So I think it's just maybe thinking differently about how capital is raised and just trying to look at how to be able to pool dedicated pools of capital towards this cause, because I believe that there are investors who are interested in actually mobilizing capital for this, for this cause. And so I think a lot more work, one, going into developing the bond markets as they are, and then also just working with potential issuers to look at what they already have, because they probably have, when you look at banks, for example, I've given that as an example, they already probably have a pool of assets that could actually be, put together and facilitate gender bond issuances. So I think it's just really having that discussion. And for us at FSD Africa, we are really keen to be able to support demonstrative transactions, trying to do that work in terms of preparing issuers to actually, issue these bonds. So I think it's a good discussion, and we are really happy to hear from any potential issuers and how we be able to support on the corporate side as well. Thanks.
A question came up from somebody in the chat, speaking of South Africa, about because that was called out as one of the high potential countries to get started in. Was the research done around the uptake, the potential uptake from, from different target audiences, from pools of companies, or those who would be on the target of such a bond? Can you talk a little bit about what you uncovered during the research phase around that, or if there's more work to be done around that? And that could be for you or Gaia or.
Sure, yeah. So the work that Mary mentioned at the beginning, so we did a big piece of research and landscaping of gender bonds and how they've been used, and also a lot of stakeholder engagement. So we spoke with investors, potential issuers, banks, in primarily 3 countries, and one of them was South Africa. And in South Africa particularly, I think there's a lot of potential for this. Increasingly, it's a market that's receptive to label debt, and you can see that through the flurry of green issuances that have come to market. But South Africa, particularly, there's a strong alignment with inclusion, and gender inclusion fits within that. So we did speak to specific investors in South Africa who would have indicated keen interest to hold such an instrument should it come to market. You're absolutely right. There's 2 things. One is a senior unsecured instrument doesn't give the investor direct access to the underlying asset. So money is full, but you ring fence proceeds. If you're a bank and you lend to women-owned businesses, you would ring fence proceeds and allocate a portion, an equal amount of money to those users. Otherwise, you could do securitization. And actually, one particular investor we spoke to was absolutely keen for securitization. They wanted access to the specific assets, to the specific loans. There are fewer that's maybe not the easiest instrument to open with, but certainly if you're thinking about that, then the first thing to do is engage with investors on what their preference is. And in that case, it would have been a securitization, obviously, with all the credit considerations that go with that. And the market infrastructure that you need. Absolutely, I think South Africa is absolutely prime ground for a gender bond.
Great. And I'm noticing in the chat window this point from Ayanda, thank you, that the South Africa government, with support from UN Women, is following up with a more detailed landscape and gender bond framework now. And FSD Africa is providing some guidance, which is really great. I think the question was very much about, are we also asking the pipeline? So we're asking the investors, but it's also equally important to be really talking to those that would be in the pipeline about what kind of capital they need and would this be helpful? And so it's great to see that landscaping work going on. If people want to plug into it, it feels like there's a good place to plug in. There's a question which is, under the use of proceeds bonds, how are the proceeds ring fenced and tracked given the fungibility of money? That came in from Belinda Bacco.
Sure, so that's what I kind of, touched on just now. So money absolutely is fungible, thank goodness. And so you would typically earmark proceeds internally within your treasury management processes for allocation and track these. So you can do this in two ways. You can do this sort of in a sort of indirect way and say, we are going to be spending X on these activities, or you can actually open a separate account. It really depends on your treasury management preference and sort of your how easy it is for you as an issuer to do that. But there's two ways you can do that.
Another question that's come in is around currency. The currency of denomination of the gender bond, is that something that we need to consider? And the comment was, this came in from Jonah Sweeney. I imagine most bonds are USD denominated, but for the use of proceeds, local currency might be needed. And how is this managed, as it can obviously lead to mismatches?
Sure, I think that's actually true of all bonds, not just gender bonds. And so there is, for example, I work at Lionshead, we do a lot of work on local currency and the need for local currency in markets, and local currency, local market development is really important. So you're absolutely right. The vast majority of label debt is international, it's blue chip. So there's a huge need for issuer diversification in the label debt space. Linking to USD is risky whenever your cash flows are in local currency. That's just the reality of things. So, for example, in South Africa, we'd imagine a gender bond very much being rand denominated, issued by a local issuer for local lending. Equally, that applies everywhere. Obviously, where DFIs are involved, there's a requirement on their part to see either local currency or hard currency. And you can always back-to-back that through a DFI, but it doesn't affect the nature of the bond. Essentially, you can do this in any currency. Obviously, if you're issuing a local bond in a local market in local currency, you're not going to probably get as many international investors, just because it's harder for them to operate in specific markets. And this is something I know Mary and Evans also spend a lot of their time on.
So Mary, do you want to add something?
Yes, please, if I may add to that. So of course, when you look at sovereign bond issuances, issuing in hard currency, of course, just increases the risk for the jurisdiction issuing. And we know, for example, in various jurisdictions, this post-COVID environment, their fiscal, their debt sustainability position is really has worsened because of that particular issue. So I think for us, we really do encourage as much as possible just doing the local currency bond market because of those issues as well, just to weather, especially for the sovereign.
And obviously, if anybody in the chat window wants to weigh in here, I think that would be great. I'm going to switch gears and talk about a question that came up about incentives and tax incentives specifically. So someone asked the question, most theme bonds in developing markets, such as the infrastructure bonds, have been very attractive because of incentives provided in the bond prospectus, like tax exemptions, especially from the ones issued by the government. Are there any prospects of such incentives provided for gender bonds?
That really depends on the market regulator and on the authorities in that country. So these are things that are defined at national capital market level. I know that in some countries, as the person asking the question stated, there absolutely is a tax incentive for green bonds. So that it really depends. It's not an automatic sort of cross-border sort of inbuilt criteria of the bond. It depends on where it's being issued and if in that market you are eligible for a tax break because of the label that you're using. So that's something that regulators and capital market authorities absolutely should think about if they are looking to engender issuance, because investors obviously care about this.
So Robin, do you want to add in here? I know you posted something in the chat window.
Sure, so that was more just in terms of the question on ring fencing and the use of proceeds management. So for example, so just to raise this on the sovereign side, and Liz Bronda, maybe you could come in on this as well, is where governments have very strong gender responsive budgeting practices and policies, and there are many countries that do, that ensures that gender is sort of thread throughout the budgeting process. Tracking the use of proceeds then becomes a bit easier. So that is, I think, when we're looking at countries, who would be well placed based on their national action plans and their commitments to gender, having those mechanisms in place to obviously track the allocation and the spending is obviously critical and key. And I don't know, Liz, if you want to add anything to that as well.
Thank you. Well, just to say, I think that it is these two components. I mean, one is the framework, and we've talked a lot about the need to ensure that the framework is being met with, with the gender lens. The social bond framework from ICMA and others that are being put out there, including the SDG bond framework from the UNDP, that is just specifically addressing gender, but it's also the portfolio. And you need to look into the portfolio and what is the incentive essentially for organizations to look into the portfolio and identify those parts of their business that are really oriented towards women and girls, and how can that be exposed. And the incentive is that impact investors are looking for these types of assets. They want to see that there's alignment of their investments with social results. And so the work is really up to the issuers to do. And this is where these kinds of partnerships become really important. As Robin said, I mean, UN Women has very deep relationships with sovereigns that help them create their gender national plans, and they're very rich documents that not everyone looks into in the type of depth to say these are the programs that the government is really supporting. But just identifying those as a portfolio and saying these are the programs that are being supported by the funding is really where you find that linkage. And so the extra effort is really looking into what companies and sovereigns are already doing and identifying that. And the gap that we're seeing is that there just hasn't been that linkage to the gender data, or even knowing whether loans are going to women-owned businesses or men-owned businesses. That that work is really what's there. But what we've seen in the green bond market is that the investors are asking for this, and there's pressure which is being created on the issuer. We haven't seen that with the other SDGs, but it is there. There just isn't as much specificity around it. It took quite a long time for the green bond market to develop. So we're hoping that accelerates by shining a light on the opportunities of finding those portfolios within the issuers and linking them to the bond issuance.
So I think that's part of the goal of this webinar series and the report itself, is to get that demand coming from the investor side, right? To really uncover where can that really come from. Thank you so much, Liz. I know we'll come back to you. There's another question from Conrad Afande, who's bringing up the question about youth. And saying, given the high population of youth in Africa and in line with gender bonds, is there room to introduce youth bonds that have a gender angle with the same concept to fund projects and employment for, especially around employment for youth? And there's a project we've been working on at Gender Smart with Volta Capital and UNICEF to look at the pathways to employment for adolescent girls and young women. Not to say that we're not interested in the pathways to employment for men and boys, but just to say that in initiatives that are around those pathways to employment for youth overall, where can we make sure that we're paying attention to the needs of women and girls? And is there the potential of some vehicles that would really be about financing those who are providing those pathways from education into employment. But could we see if anybody on our group of panelists here has a comment around the question around, could there be some things with a really youth focus as well as a gender focus?
Sorry, Mary, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I think with time we'll probably find that a lot of these products, there'll be a lot of how can I say this, overlap between gender, climate, and of course youth. I mean, because some of these eligible activities that we're talking about will benefit ultimately the youth. It may be young girls, for example. So I see a situation where there may or may not be any need to create a new subset of youth bonds, but maybe, I mean, who knows? But because I see there's an intersectionality that can actually take advantage of. Yeah, just thinking about the beneficiaries that we are seeking to support through the.
I would actually, yeah, I'm in complete agreement with Mary. I don't think sort of youth it can also be covered through social bonds more broadly as well. And I know that there's work going on in that space in Europe as well, through the EBRD, thinking about youth employment, which speaking to a colleague, if you can solve that, you can definitely be president. So the there's a lot to be done there, and there's no reason why that couldn't be overlaid with a gender lens. I mean, obviously, I do believe that any work in that should be inclusive of boys and girls, but definitely understanding, right, so what are the differences in the path of girls that we could include. It's always about inclusion, really, right? So absolutely that could be overlaid, and there's no reason why those two things couldn't work.
Yeah, especially around the pathways around education to employment, and employment within green infrastructure, within some of these other areas, and things like student housing and student loans and things like that. So another question from Conrad, I'll just add this in. I applaud gender bonds and believe this was long coming. Just curious from my own understanding why we refer to them as gender bonds when gender implies both sexes, and a male dominated project also applies. So just to sort of make it clear to folks on the phone, on this call, when we're talking about gender, we are talking about looking at the areas where paying attention to the really specific gendered needs of the target population is what we're talking about doing. So if we're, for example, talking about, again, going back to green infrastructure, talking about employment, it's not to say that we'd say we only want to see women getting jobs, but we want to see the recruitment, the retention, the training, the access to those roles to be at a specific marker to include a specific percentage of women being included. And so it's not to say that it's only, to your point, Gaia, it's only about women, but it's to say, where are we actually setting targets? And then where are we actually shifting the practices, not only the targets, but also the processes by which companies or projects are really being executed to really be taking into account the gendered needs. We're just coming up to, we've got about 8 minutes left, and I know we want to leave time for a couple of last thoughts here, but just a couple more questions that came up. Just again, where do we really see the potential? Just maybe take a minute on this one around looking at women in informal economies and really thinking about the women in chamas, the women who are in cooperatives, the potential for any of this. And it's sort of the opposite of the, the corporate gender bond, but do we see this as having a strong potential? And so if somebody could just react to that one, and then we'll go on.
So when we did the original research on the landscaping, this was particularly relevant in, for example, in Kenya, where there is a lot of sort of shared schemes for saving. The challenge there is not around a gender bond specifically, it's about a bond altogether, because you need to have a certain, you need to meet certain criteria in order to participate in the debt capital markets, which are around size, but also credit worthiness, general sort of institutional maturity. And so that is really more the challenge. The product in itself, the underlying asset, is absolutely eligible for something like a gender bond. It's just about finding the right mechanism, the right vehicle or structure to package that so that it's something you can present to the market. So in the case of savings cooperatives, for example, you would need some sort of vehicle with some sort of credit enhancement in order to make this something that institutional and local investors would be interested in. There's also a lot of difference in sort of institutional investor appetite across countries. So there's more adventurous institutional investors, and what we find that in different countries, and particularly sort of in Kenya and to a degree also in South Africa, there's a lot of conservatism. People like nice vanilla bonds and blue chip issuers, and we really need to move away from that in order to have an inclusive environment. So it takes more effort on the engineering side of the product in order to bring those issuances to market, and it's worthwhile doing, but people should be aware that.
So if I think where we're starting out is to say, where could the first gender bonds be? I think you guys have made the case to say we need some things that look more like what people are used to, things that look familiar, things that have familiar structures. And then we also should be pushing to say, where's the innovation potential and where can we go further based on what the real needs of different populations, of which women and girls we're talking about. And I think this is kind of true in gender smart investing overall. Which women and girls are we talking about? In which places, in which sectors, in which kinds of businesses and domains? And let's be specific around that, because we're going to need to, in order to really see this grow, is just to have that level of specificity. I think we're really, really interested to hear who on the call, after this call, would be excited about engaging with UN Women and FSD Africa and Lion's Head in really being one of those first to market opportunities to really be, to be able to bring that forward. And based on where you sit, and we've got over 100 people here on this call playing different roles in the ecosystem, where can you contribute? I think that's the other thing that people really want to understand. So just in the interest of time, I think it would be great to go to UN Women, FSD Africa. Actually, Gaia, since you're on screen, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to UN Women, and then we'll leave the last word for FSD Africa. Evan Bruner, actually, I'd love to have one more minute from you too, and then we'll finish at FSD Africa, and then we'll wrap up. So Gaia, just in 1 minute, any last thoughts?
So I think for me, the part of the motivation of doing things like this is to plant the seed in people's minds, right? That this is something you can do, something your clients can do, something worth thinking about. And then there are benefits to this. There are broader economic benefits to engaging in thematic issuances. So really sort of, we are very much interested in this space as an advisor, as an entity. We have an asset management business as well. So very keen to get feedback from the market in terms of how does this resonate with you? Is this something you're considering? Questions, sort of, we're very keen to be part of this conversation because we think it's really important, and we think it's something worth supporting broadly, whether it's sovereign, cooperatives, corporates trying to change the status quo within themselves. Sort of, I think all of these different dimensions are really, really important to the conversation. There's no single solution that sort of fits everybody. So I think that's sort of the final thought for me, but sort of it needs creative thought, this space.
And Gaia, I know we've spoken quite a lot about the need for standards. And so just really mobilizing people around the standards. Exactly. Okay, so Robin, Lisbeth, one of you, if you want to share from UN Women. Thank you, Gaia.
Sure. So touching on that point of standards, I think when we look at sovereign issuances in particular, while we don't necessarily have standards that are globally accepted and agreed, we do have national action plans, gender action plans that are agreed that governments can be using. I think the other thing from an incentive side is to look at it to say, we really need to look at the sustainability of debt when it comes to sovereign issuances. And I think that is, that's something that governments can take on. What is the human rights element when we look at sovereign debt, when we look at sustainability? And I think these factors that we're talking about, climate, gender, youth, etc., are all really key fundamentals that need to be considered when we're having these conversations around debt. So I think that's from my side. I don't know, Liz, if you want else to just jump in on anything there.
Yeah, well, just to say also on the corporate side, UN Women has issued the Women Economic Empowerment Principles, and these are available for corporates to also use and follow. So I think there's enough out there, actually. It's really a question of focus, and we're discussing this because those ideas are now becoming more in the forefront, and everyone is looking for really building back, particularly out of COVID, in a more sustainable and equitable way. And therefore it's a very, topical conversation to be having.
Thank you. Evan, and then we're going to turn it back to Mary to wrap us up. Evan, just in 30 seconds.
Great. Yeah, I think that the one things, or the two things that I would like to really touch on would be, we've been having this discussion around blue bond or green bond and social bond principles. Putting that aside, the sustainability linked bond principles, which are neither tied to social or traditional green types of instruments. This is really an area where there's a lot of opportunity to be addressing gender related issues as well. I think that there's plenty of space for leadership there, and hope to see more. We would certainly love to talk to issuers or anybody who's interested in learning more about that particular space. But I would say that there's lots of impact there.
Terrific. Back over to you, Mary, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, everyone. I think this has been such an interesting discussion. Very exciting topic. I think there's just so much to do. I feel that real success in all this will be just seeing more capital being mobilized through this product. And I think there's so much to be done. So for us from FSD Africa, we're really grateful to UN Women, Lion's Head, who we've been working on this study, because it's really initiated this discussion with, of course, the likes of you, Evan and Suzanne, and everyone else on the call. So this has been really, really rich. There's a lot we can continue to think about. And I think the big to get things happening in terms of actually mobilizing capital using this instrument. And I know that means a lot of heavy lifting. So I think just to appreciate you all, again, as we mentioned, this recording will be available after this on our website, but we'll actually share it directly with you who have been able to join us, and the presentation as well. So yeah, I think our time is up. That you were able to join us. And thank you so much for your insightful discussions. Thank you to the panelists, the participants. Thank you all and have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.